If you're a high performer looking to grow and make an impact, but feeling stuck, underappreciated, and burned out at work, you're in the right place. I'm Melissa Vining, and this is the Job Search for High Performing Misfits podcast. I help high performers leave draining jobs behind, reclaim their careers, and land roles in organizations where they can thrive. Tune in for tips, insights, and inspiration for your journey to fulfilling work that fits you. Hello and welcome to Job Search for High Performing Misfits. Today I am very happy to welcome Sara Kobilka back to the show. You may remember her from our episode last season about multi-potentialites. Sara is the owner of Renaissance Woman Consulting. She's an educator, scientist, journalist, coach, and entrepreneur. And she helps fellow Renaissance people and people who are looking to change careers, change industries, build unconventional careers that fit them. So today we're going to be talking about interviewing, and what we're going to do is go over some interview preparation strategies. We're going to talk about common questions that you're going to get asked in interviews and the kind of secrets behind those questions and how you're going to want to think about preparing your answers. And then we're going to also go over what you should keep in mind in terms of your questions for the interviewers. And we'll talk a little bit about the mindset behind that and some potential questions that you might want to ask in your interview. So Sara, I am glad to have you back. Thank you for being here.
I'm so glad to see you virtually. I'm sad that our attempt at getting together in person was thwarted, but good to see you again in this virtual space and someday in person.
Yes. And for those of you who are not or have not listened to our previous episode, we talked a little bit about how we are both from Minnesota, and we happened to both be there over Christmas this year, visiting our families, and we were trying to get together and everyone had the flu. So it did not work out, but
like a large percentage of the country, it sounds like.
Exactly. Yes. So Sara, do you want to kind of reintroduce yourself for maybe people who didn't listen to the previous episode, or for anyone who might have forgotten all about the great things that you are bringing?
Thank you. Well, my name is Sara Kobilka, and I refer to myself as the Renaissance Woman. I came up with that term when I created my business 5 years ago because I am that multi-passionate, multi-potentialite. I'm someone who's worked in a lot of different areas. I've been a TV meteorologist. I've been executive director of an arboretum. I have worked in higher education. I've taught bell choirs, workout classes. I've done all these different things. And it was really important to me to find a term that kind of pulled that together and didn't simplify and hide my complexity, but instead embraced it as an asset and something that I bring with me to whatever career, to whatever project I'm involved with. And so that positive spin on it was what coming up with the term Renaissance Woman meant for me in my communication of who I am, because Melissa is a fellow Renaissance woman, as I would call her. And we Renaissance people can be a little much sometimes if we were to try to explain everything about ourselves.
Yeah, and I love your idea about bringing the uniqueness and reframing it in terms of an asset, because I think that applies in a lot of different ways, not only for a Renaissance person, but for anyone who has, something that doesn't fit inside the box. And we talk about that a lot on the podcast too. So thank you for getting us started with that. And you actually have your own podcast now called Connecting the Dots with the Renaissance People. Did you want to tell us a little bit about that before we dive in?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is internationally renowned in that I can say that someone on every single continent, including Antarctica, has listened to at least one episode. That doesn't mean that millions of people know about it, but I'm really excited about it. And Melissa, you were my second guest, which was wonderful. And the show is all about that positive mindset towards Renaissance people. It's bringing Renaissance people like us together for conversations to talk about what are spaces where we have succeeded, where we felt accepted and celebrated for our complexity and the things that we bring. What are some of the challenges that we regularly encounter, including trying to come up with an elevator pitch and explain ourselves in a short period of time. And then we also just have a lot of fun diving down rabbit holes of what we're interested in, because Renaissance people are great at like finding this thing and becoming really interested in doing all this research. And they oftentimes love to share that information with other people. There's just great joy in kind of nerding out together. So that is another part of the show, is like, let's nerd out about whatever shared area of interests. And for you and I, the fact that we're both career coaches, and in particular, we have a lot of specialized knowledge with regards to neurodiversity when it comes to careers, and thinking about what's next for you was a great, fun place that we dove into. But we also, like you said, are from Minnesota. We both played flute. We both are moms with kids. Lots of overlaps between our Venn diagrams.
Yes. So we will put the link to that in the show notes for anyone who's interested in learning more about that podcast. And let's go ahead and dive into our discussion about interviewing. So let's start off with some ideas and tips around doing the preparation, because I think sometimes people maybe know that they should prepare, but don't know exactly how to go about doing that in the most effective way. Or sometimes we just get into it and we're like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and do the interview. And then it turns out it's not quite what we expected. So what are some tips that you usually give people when they're preparing for the interview on how to go about this in the best way possible?
I've got a lot of tips available, and a number of these can be found in my newsletter. It's a free newsletter. It's called Take It With You, and it's about the fact that all of your past experiences have given you wonderful skills that you then bring to that next place that you're going to in your career journey. I'm really thinking about your career as a journey, not just like a single destination. You're never going anywhere else. So, I'll give you links for some of the most useful things that I've written about. And one that is maybe a unique tip that not everybody is giving is I recommend finding a way to do improv in your life. People are like, what? But when you're doing an interview, most of the time you don't get the questions provided ahead of time. Now, I wish it wasn't that way. That is not neuro-inclusive. And so organizations that give you questions ahead of time might give you kind of a heads up that perhaps they're thinking a little bit more thoughtfully about being a neuro-inclusive space, but that just doesn't happen a lot of the time. And so that means you're going to get a question that you may have to come up with an answer to on the spot. And improv is just a skill. My brother actually is part of a professional musical theater improv troupe in New York City. And I've actually taught improv classes with him for middle schoolers when we were growing up in high school in Minnesota. And improvisation is a skill. It's a muscle that gets stronger the more you practice it. So yes, you could go to the point of joining an improv group. But that's not the only way to do it. In the newsletter, I suggest things like, what is a role-playing game that you can be part of? Is there a Dungeons and Dragons group that you can be involved with? Because that is improv, that's creativity, that's coming up with things. Another suggestion that I have is find a small child, ideally under the age of like 7, and play dolls, play superheroes, play whatever, play Harry Potter, whatever their interest might be. Act out those things with them, and you are doing improv. Volunteer with a youth group, grab a niece, a nephew, anything like that. And if you help a fellow adult by taking care of their child and playing with them for a while, they'll thank you for that break as well. But kids are so great. They improvise like nothing else. They're going to send you like questions that come out of nowhere. And you're going to have to respond to that. And that practice is absolutely wonderful. So find a way to do some improv in your life is one of my more unique suggestions.
That's a great suggestion. I also wanted to add to that because you had mentioned it's really hard to predict all the questions that are going to be asked. And I think a lot of people get stuck on that and they try to think, okay, let me try to come up with every single possible question they're going to ask me, which is, of course, impossible and also causes us to go down a crazy rabbit hole and spend way too much time. So the other thing that I would suggest, in addition to what you said, is thinking about not every question itself but the main topics that are going to get asked. So we're looking back at the job description and we're thinking, okay, these are the things that I see here that are important for this job. So, of course, that means they're going to ask me questions related to those topics. So, at that point, you can go back to your previous experience and say, what have I done or what stories do I have that relate to these topics? You're thinking through, coming up with your list and not necessarily scripting everything, but you have your bullet points for yourself. And that way, when they ask you about that topic, you have a story you can plug in there.
And I even suggest for some people, some of my clients, when they're interviewing, to have like a Post-it note, if it's a virtual interview, right on their computer that maybe has some of those facts that they're worried they're going to forget in the heat of the moment. And by taking away the stress of having to remember the exact facts or the order that things happened in, then they can just relax a little bit more and focus on telling that story.
What do you find is the most important part about the storytelling piece of this? Because we've already kind of started hinting at the fact that you have to be telling stories during your interviews. So I want to take it a step back a little bit and talk about why should we even do that?
Yeah, well, I think what you need to remember is you're interviewing with a human. You're talking to a real person. You have to jump through all the computerized hoops to get to the interview point. But when it comes to talking to real human beings, the way humans connect and how we have always connected as a species is by telling stories, and specifically verbally telling stories. We had the ability to tell stories to each other long before we had written language. It is the native way that we communicate. And so by telling a story, by connecting with another person, by including maybe some emotional elements in it, because emotion in stories is also very important and makes us seem human and seem like the kind of person that you want on your team, that you want to collaborate with, that you want to do things with.
I think one of my goals anytime I'm helping someone prepare for an interview is just to get in the habit of always answering with a story. So every time I ask a question, I want to hear a real story, a real example of something that relates to that. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about other pieces of research that could be helpful. So we're not only just thinking about the questions they might ask, but we might be thinking about the company themselves or the interviewers. Do you have any tips on how people might go a little bit deeper into their research about those things before they even show up at the interview?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest tools that we have nowadays is social media. And there's a desire for the tone, for the language, for the verbiage that they're using in their social media posts to be representative of the culture, of the values of the organization, of the mission or vision. And so when you can look at what they put out on social media, that is likely to be a better representation of how they at least want to be perceived. Now, it isn't, they can hide things. You can gloss things over. That social media does a great job of doing that. But you can see perhaps what they aspire to, and you can reflect back to them that same type of language. And if you are looking for a career in more mission-driven organizations, if you're looking towards nonprofits, if you're looking towards the educational space, those spaces tend to be a lot more mission-driven versus profit-driven. And so speaking their language, talking about their values, talking about things that matter to them, who do they stand up for, who are they against, what problems do they solve, that is basically giving them like the inside hint, subconscious message of, I am already one of you. Because every business you go to, every industry that you switch between, they all have their own language. And so if you can show that you already speak, or at least are trying to speak their language, that goes a long ways.
I think another way of looking at this that I find helpful is thinking about how do they measure success? So, like in the examples you were giving, if it's a mission-driven organization, like I'll take the organization I work for example, we try to help people get jobs. So the measure of success is how many people got jobs after they used our services. whereas someone in a corporate space might be looking to make more money or make things more efficient or whatever that is. So really understanding that before you go into the interview. And as you said, this research helps in all aspects of the process because you can then communicate that on your resume and in your cover letter and during your interviews. And I think that goes along with speaking the employer's language.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can speak some of those like niche terms. For example, when you were talking about if you were an organization that is um, a for-profit organization and you throw out ROI, they're like, "Oh, you speak our language." If you go to a nonprofit and use the acronym ROI, that is like a red flag. This is not one of us. These people don't care about what we care about.
Yeah, and that's a good point for people who might be changing industries, like a lot of the people you work with, because we want to make sure we're removing some of that jargon and we're, again, focusing on speaking the language of the person that we're talking to, because otherwise they're going to think either directly or maybe kind of indirectly that you don't fit here.
Yeah. And I think another thing that it can allow you to do is it can help you realize what terms, and some of them are jargon, some of them are words that have multiple meanings. So another area of training that I do is science communication training. And a lot of times scientists are really good at understanding like, oh, I shouldn't use deoxyribonucleic acid. That's too big of a word. But they don't realize that a word like system means different things, even to other scientists. A system for a meteorologist is different than a biologist, is different than a politician. And so you can see if there's any words that you think you know what they mean, but as you're reading their social media or their press releases or whatever things you can find out about a company, and you realize they're using a common word in a way that's different than how you would use it, you can maybe do a little bit more research.
That's a great point. And I think you can take that from the job description too, because sometimes you might see, for example, like a software that they use and it's listed on their job description. And maybe you've never used it, but you still have to go into the interview with awareness of it, right? So you still have to go look it up. You have to understand what is the point of this software. Okay, maybe you're going to ask more questions around it, but at least it shows that you have that baseline knowledge.
It shows that you do your homework. And
Yes.
in a competitive job market, it's the people who have done their homework, who've put a little bit more time and really show that they care about getting the job, that are going to be seen more favorably than people who just show up. It's just not a job market where there's a shortage of labor and you can just show up.
Yes, that's exactly true. So let's get into some of these common interview questions and we'll talk about what it kind of looks like on the back end and why they're asking these things. And of course, the first question that you always get is tell me about yourself or some variation of that question. So in your experience and with working with clients and everything, what is the real question behind this? Like, why are they asking this?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. First, some of them do it because they feel like that's what you're supposed to ask first. It's just like the default. So I don't think they're always like maniacally trying to do something behind the scenes when they ask. Second, sometimes they're interviewing a lot of people and they can't keep track of all the people in their mind. Or maybe they just came from a really big meeting and yeah, they read your resume and they loved you and everything like that 2 weeks ago when you scheduled the interview. And now you're in there and they're like, who is this person again? So it's a quick refresher to explain who you are. Now, in some of my jobs that have involved communication, it is sometimes a test to see, can you speak succinctly? Because if you're going to be the PR person, if you're going to be the person representing us in front of thousands of people, if you're going to be sending out emails, I need to know that you have some capacity to speak succinctly about yourself.
Yeah, and I think this is also an opportunity. even though they didn't necessarily ask you for an example of your work, you could actually weave that in even from the beginning with this first question. So you might start off by just saying, this is kind of how I define myself. These are the kinds of jobs I've had in the past. Of course, we're not starting with, when I was growing up, I was doing XYZ, right? That's not what they're asking. They're asking about kind of your professional life. So you're starting with, this is who I am. This is maybe what led me here, a little bit about that. And this is an example of what I can do, what I can offer, the kinds of success that I've had.
And it's also sometimes an opportunity to, again, show that you've done your homework on the organization and, if you can, the person who's interviewing you. And it's a chance to maybe make that little bit of a connection. You talked about, like, don't say when I was a kid growing up. But let's say I was interviewing with you for a job. I could say, well, ever since I grew up in Minnesota, which I saw that you're also from Minnesota. Yay, go Timberwolves, go Twins, go Vikings. And then, you can put those little spots of connection. Or if you're going to talk about, like, growing up, my aunt worked for your organization and I heard all about it all the time. Like little spots of, hey, I have this connection to you, to your organization, to the work that you do. And so you can just weave those little bits in. It doesn't even have to be fully complete sentences. Just little spots here of, hey, I'm a real person. I'm somebody who you might like to be around.
Yeah, and that's a good example, I think, of why we want to do some of this research in advance, because sometimes you might get some of that during the conversation, but sometimes you won't. And for some people coming into the conversation, it's harder to figure out even how I can get that information. So if you go and do some of the research beforehand and you say, oh my gosh, Melissa's from Minnesota, I'm going to intentionally bring that up. And that might even be before they start asking you questions, right? It could be just in that little bit of warm-up conversation that you might have, like the greeting and how was your trip over here, or, how's the weather there, and get some of it in there too.
And I think it's also a place to show your personality a little bit. If you're somebody who's a little bit more lighthearted. For me, for example, if somebody said, tell me a little bit about yourself, I would say, well, how much time have you got? Okay, just kidding. It does take a while to fully explain me, but... And so even having kind of that language to do a little bit of a joke, or even, well, I used to say that I was this, but now I'm saying this. So you can put those little bits of things intentionally thought out so that they don't become long-winded, but not scripted out, because that's the other thing, is that people can tell when someone's reading a script. And unless you're really, really good, there's a few people that I've worked in TV who are anchors who have literally read from a teleprompter every single day of their workday in their life. But most people sound fake if they are saying something that either they've completely memorized or that they're reading off a piece of paper. So I really encourage people to do that bullet point method you talked before about. Put the highlight things. If there's like a phrasing that you want to make sure to use, practice using that phrase, but don't script out exactly how you're going to answer the thing.
Yeah, I mean, another thing that often happens when you're completely scripted is that one tiny thing can throw you off. Like maybe they interrupt you, or, something else happens in the environment and all of a sudden you are completely lost. And I've had this experience even as a flute player, like in, college, when they're like, memorize this piece and then go play it. And if something interrupts that flow, now all of a sudden I'm repeating like the same line and I can't get out of it.
I had that happen on a piano recital. I was playing the Mozart Twinkle variations, which is all these variations, different ways of playing that Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star melody. And if you get off, you are lost. You are just lost. But some interesting scientific research has shown that if you have something that you need to learn, rather than practicing it from beginning to end or doing the exact thing, it's actually better to practice it in little chunks and practice starting in the middle and practice starting in different places so that you don't only have it memorized in this exact order in this one space. Or even other research has shown that when you're taking a class in college and you get the freedom to sit wherever you want in the room or study wherever you want, you should sit in different places and you should study in multiple spaces, because then your memorization of something or your knowledge of the topic isn't tied to a specific setting. So that means that when you're practicing your interview questions, don't always do it in the exact same space. Maybe don't always do practice interviews with the exact same people. Put yourself in multiple settings so that you have that knowledge that you've prepared ahead of time intimately inside of you, and you're not relying on the setting to give you the memory trigger cues.
I love that. Okay, so let's talk about the next question that you're probably also going to get asked. And I think, touched on this a little bit already, because it's something along the lines of, why do you want to work here? Or why this job? So when they ask that, what are they looking for? Why is it that they're asking?
They want to know that you did your homework. They want you to show that you actually understand what they're about, that they're not going to have to teach you from the very ground level everything about who we are and what we do. And they want to know that your values align with their values, that maybe some of your habits align with their habits, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think that this is also a time when they're looking to see that you didn't just apply to them just because you need a job, even though you might need a job that might be very real for you.
Yes.
But they want to see that you are intentional about, I think I'm going to fit with this company or this organization, and this is why. And that's actually part of the reason why I recommend for people to have a target company list. And we're not just going out and applying to everything everywhere, but we're actually trying to figure out, what is it that I'm looking for? What is it that I'm bringing? What kinds of companies are aligned with this? And then I'm going to focus my energy there. Do you use any similar strategies with your clients?
I talk about the idea of a hose. I'm also an avid gardener. And when you have a hose, there's different settings on the nozzle for spraying. You can spray a mist and water goes everywhere. And if you tried to spray a mist at something like a can to knock it over, no luck. You have to target the energy of that water coming out into a small spot to truly make a movement, to actually have an impact. So strategy in terms of focusing is so important. And think from the perspective of the business. If they are going to hire you, they're going to take time to interview a whole bunch of people. They're going to hire you. They're going to train you. And then it's not the right fit for you. And then you're going to leave in a short time period. That's not worth it for them. So they need to find somebody from the very beginning who is the right fit for them if they really want to invest the time and effort into training you to be their next employee.
Yeah, I love that example of the hose, because I think that also ties back to the fact that when you are more intentional overall, it helps the whole job search. So you get to this point and you don't have to start over, because you've already done this research. You already know that you're excited about this company. So you can go in and be a lot more authentically excited and say, like, yeah, I've been following you. I'm really interested in what you're doing in XYZ space. And this is why my experience and my, priorities fit with this. So you mentioned when you were talking about that last question that sometimes there's a concern on the employer side about, am I going to train you? Am I going to spend all of this time just to have you leave? And so one of the questions they're going to ask you that tries to get at that is going to be, why are you leaving your current role? Or why did you leave your last role? Is there anything else underneath that you find is important for a job seeker to think about?
That one's a question that can be hard because you want to protect yourself. You don't necessarily want to burn bridges, especially if you're not changing industries. Let's say you're staying in the same industry or you're staying in the same town, but the reason you want to get out of the job is because this one person at the job is awful and you want to get away from them. I've had that. I had a very bad situation with one person connected with the company, and I just had more than anything to get away from her. But when I applied for my next job, that is not what I would have told them if they had asked me that question. It is more about projecting a positive, I'm looking forward to finding a place where I can do this, I can use these skills that aligns with my values, that type of thing, as opposed to, well, I really hated this aspect, or I had this really bad person, or whatever it might be that was the problem. The industry was going in the hole, all those negative things. You don't need to say all of those. You can instead take that more positive spin and say, I'm really looking for an opportunity to do this, to live this type of way, to have these types of values.
Yeah, which starts with you understanding what it is that you're really looking for. And of course, you have to do that before you get to this point. And then the other thing I would suggest, if you do have an answer like that, where you're saying, this is what I'm looking for, this is what's important to me, you can actually end your statement with a question and ask them back, do you have that, or do you value that, or does that align with this company? Give me an example. And now that's a good way of pivoting away from this question that feels really uncomfortable, kind of no matter what the answer is.
I guess the only time where that question has not been a problem for me is when I was moving because of my spouse. And so, for example, my husband finished his doctorate in Iowa and we moved back to Wisconsin. And so I had to leave what was my dream job. I was actually really sad to be leaving it to follow him for his next move. So in that case, I kind of let them know. I'm like, I really loved what I was doing and I wish I didn't have to move, but I'm following my partner. And so I'm looking forward to finding a new opportunity that allows me to continue to build on the things I was doing in my last job.
Yeah. So sometimes I get questions around this because, we talked about how if you're leaving because there's a toxic situation, but what if you're leaving because you were laid off or because you were fired? What kinds of advice do you give people around that?
Yeah, well, I'll just say one thing, which is I haven't heard about this question being asked all that much. A lot of people that I've worked with haven't had someone ask it, so it's maybe not as much of a concern for people. The layoff and fired, I think, is just talking about, like, there was a mismatch, and you don't necessarily have to get into the details, or they were going in a different direction is another way of wording it. There's a really interesting podcast called Proxy by Yowei Shaw. And Yowei Shaw was NPR's Invisibilia, the podcast. She was one of the hosts of that. And she got laid off by NPR. And her whole podcast is about like finding proxies that people can talk to help them with emotional conundrums that they're encountering. But she did this whole 3-part series about getting laid off, the emotional side of it, how she handled it, talking to experts in fields that are relevant to people being laid off. So she had some better suggestions in that podcast series. It's some of her very first episodes that she's done that I do recommend to people who have been laid off or fired, listening to them and kind of learning from those suggestions.
That's great. We can link that in the show notes. And I also think some of the language that you gave about like mismatch and different direction is really helpful for people because you can be truthful in this answer without giving all the information, right? And I think that's generally the strategy here. And I also wanted to add that a lot of times for you as the individual, if you get laid off, it feels terrible and it feels like maybe you did something wrong. But a lot of the times that's not really the case. It's just the situation that you found yourself in. And so I think employers understand that too. And of course, the getting fired situation is a little bit different. But like when you have gotten laid off, you could even say something like, well, the company went through a 10% reduction in workforce because of financial issues. And unfortunately, my position was eliminated. And that's, pretty clear, straightforward, and truthful too.
Another kind of similar type of question that some people might ask about is gaps in your resume. And so that one, in some cases, it's not necessarily legal to be asking about things with regard to pregnancy and having children and things like that. But there are some people who will ask you about gaps in your resume. I have noticed that there is a very big generational difference, though. So when I was executive director at the Arboretum in Iowa, I was working with some board members who were 80 plus years old, and we were interviewing people to come in and be our accountant. And one guy came in and he had this he had been an accountant and then he had taken a break and he had worked at a co-op and then he had gone back into accounting. And they're like, oh, he's not trustworthy. How dare he not follow his trajectory? Because different generations have different expectations of you follow that path. So I've seen that sometimes older generations are a little bit more questioning of gaps in resumes where people who are younger kind of accept it more. And then we had the pandemic happen. And all of a sudden, it changed a lot. And people are not questioning these gaps nearly as much because people had to take on caretaker responsibilities and drop out of the workforce or couldn't find work because they couldn't leave their house.
The job seekers are more worried about this than the employers are at this point, for the most part. And so I hear this question from a lot of people where they're like, I've been job searching for 6 months. Is this going to be a problem to an employer? And it's kind of just having this knowledge and having this understanding of the shift that's happened here, I think is really important. And also to recognize that if you're in a long job search and if you got laid off and you're searching, the average is 6 months. And so these long job searches, even though it feels terrible, it's actually very common. And so they're probably getting a lot of other applicants in the same place. So what about this question about your greatest weakness? Why would someone ask you that? And I know a lot of people get really scared about this question. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yes. So this one, I always like to suggest to take the positive spin on it. I always like to encourage people to be honest. For a long time, my answer to this was, I'm a perfectionist. I like things to be perfect, which is honest. And because you sometimes spend so long making something perfect, you don't get it done on time, or, it's what red flags should we have about you? What are going to be the problem things for you? Or what is your mindset? Are you a grumpy Gus, Debbie Downer type of person? Are you constantly saying, well, I don't actually turn things in on time and I can't be really counted on to get anything done? Okay, I don't want to hire you. But if you can be honest and find something that is both an opportunity for you to improve. I don't like to use the term weakness. I don't say, what are your strengths and your weaknesses? I always say, what are your strengths and what are your opportunities? And so when you can be clear-eyed and say, this is something that I've struggled with, and here's what I'm doing to improve on it, and I have seen improvements, but there's still something to go, and even here's what I'm trying to do to make this even better. That is, again, a story. And it's showing you taking an effort, being clear-eyed about what is going on and trying to find a way to improve that. So now if I were to be asked that type of question, I would probably call myself a recovering perfectionist and say that, yes, when I am editing a podcast, I do have a tendency to go in and remove every single clicking noise, and I want to get rid of every single but I can pull myself back and say, I think that's good enough, because what's the top priority right now? It's to publish the thing on time. So let's call it good enough. I put in as much effort as I could, and let's move on and let's think about what are the priorities for what's next.
Yeah, I also love that approach of saying, okay, this is what I have struggled with and this is what I've done about it, because it shows that you're self-aware, which I think is also one of the reasons why they might be asking this, to see are you the kind of person that takes a growth mindset and you're able to say, I see these areas where I'm not strong and I know that I can go and improve them, and then that you take the initiative to actually do that.
Yeah. That initiative is a huge thing.
Yes. So the last question I wanted to talk about here is if they ask you about a time when you faced a challenge or a conflict, how might you answer that? Because that is inherently kind of a negative question. And like we said already, we don't want to have to bring negativity into the conversation. So how would you frame this in a way that doesn't sound too negative?
I think that some of that same language that we talked about when it comes to job loss can come into play here. So there's different types of challenges. There's challenges that are interpersonal challenges where you can use some of that language of, well, there was a mismatch between myself and a colleague, and we had different work styles. You don't have to say they were a loser who never got anything done and I had to chase them down all the time. Like, you want to stay away from knocking them down, but you can use the language of there was a mismatch between the work styles of myself and my colleague. And again, it's about talking about what did you do proactively to handle that situation? How much did you handle on your own? And when did you realize that you needed to go to the next level and bring somebody else in?
Yeah, yeah. And at the root of this, it's a problem solving question, right? Like you're looking for them to be able to solve a problem, whether it's an interpersonal, if they ask about a conflict, they're probably leaning more towards the interpersonal emotional intelligence piece. And maybe they're asking just about a challenge overall. And in that case, maybe you pull in some technical challenge that you had. And that could be a problem solving example too. So I would suggest for people to have at least one like problem solving technical example and then one that relates to either a colleague or a client or customer or something that kind of shows that interpersonal aspect.
It doesn't have to be a problem that was solved perfectly either. It can be a situation where you got it to a point of being good enough and you learned from it. And maybe even if you can say, and then the next time that something like this came up, I was able to handle it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I love that approach. So let's talk a little bit about the idea of a two-way interview because I think people go into interviews thinking that they're going to get interrogated and it's all about them answering all the questions perfectly. And this causes a lot of extra stress for you as the person going into the interview. So I like to reframe this as you're interviewing them and they're interviewing you, and this is a conversation. So what do you suggest to people in terms of like approaching it with this mindset?
Sometimes when you are going into an interview and you're doing your homework, you're going to find what you think is the answer to a question, but that doesn't mean that you don't still ask the question in the interview. I had somebody who I was working with, and they had chronic illness. She hadn't had a chronic illness her entire life, but she knew she just needed that flexibility that if she had to take a nap for an hour and then come back and get things done and then work until midnight, that she'd be able to do that. So the job description said the word flexible. But I encouraged her in the interview, you need to ask and find out what flexible really means. And maybe give an example. You don't have to necessarily say, this is what my need is, because that's another thing of advocating for yourself with not fully disclosing every single thing. But if it's a chronic illness and you need flexibility, it is worth your time and it is worth the interviewer's time for you to find out more details about whether they can meet your needs, whether they can accommodate you in the way that you need to be accommodated. And so you look for those words like flexible, maybe fast-paced environment. These things could be code words. And so you look for some of those words in the job description, and then you follow up with questions about that. There's also what you were talking about before is talking about the environment. What does a normal day look like? Or how does your team handle it when someone is suddenly out sick? Or has technology issues like, hey, the world is shut down because of the pandemic, or my child's school just went virtual because of a flu outbreak, or whatever it might be. And so asking some of those questions about like, how do they handle these things? What do they do when there's these emergencies that come up? Those are really great things to learn about as well.
Yeah, and I think along with that, you should be asking them for examples. And we already talked about how we want to be giving examples, and they're probably expecting you to give examples. So it's perfectly reasonable for you to also expect examples from them. And I think that can be a huge clue for you if they can answer your questions, if they can give you examples, if it feels like they're being transparent with that. Or on the other side of that, are they not able to answer? Are they hiding? Are they vague, right? Some of those red flags that maybe show that these things that are important to you are not things that they're able to do or that they're even thinking about.
You can also connect with them as a person. You can ask them questions about like, what drew you to this company, or what aspect of working here has been the most fulfilling for you? Or if you could change anything about like the work that you were doing to make it even better aligned with yourself. Again, that positive mindset, not like what's the worst part about working here, but what are some opportunities that your organization is looking forward to improving on themselves with, can be a good opportunity again to see, are they not answering? Are they giving half answers? Is there something read between the lines sort of thing, which can be difficult if you're autistic, for example, to catch on to those things. So you have to be careful about not making the questions too like direct, like what's your greatest weakness as a business type of question, but using that language of what are some opportunities or what are some things that your organization has worked on in the last year that you're really proud of how you've improved, and have that positive take on it too.
Yeah. I'm going to also steal one from my colleague Andrew. I interviewed him when he was starting, and he used this question at the end of our interview. And I thought it was just so brilliant and something that a lot of people can take and use, which was something along the lines of like, is there anything I can do between now and my start date that would help me best prepare to start this job? And it's a really strategic question because it gives him the information about how he can actually prepare and be like ready to go. And then also allows the interviewer to start imagining that we are going to hire this person and what does that feel like and what does that look like. So I thought that was really a great example.
That is very thoughtful. I really like that one. That makes me think of another thing that I really encourage people to do. Um, the hiring process is getting slower and slower. It's taking longer and longer. And it can be really hard because people get done with the interview and they're just so happy that it's over that they just, thank you very much, I'm out of here. And so sometimes it can be really helpful to just say, do you have a timeline that you're working with in terms of hiring this position? I know that things don't always happen immediately, but do you have a thought of a timeline on when I might hear back from you, or when you might be doing a next round of interviews, that sort of thing? It's so reassuring to leave and have that answer, as opposed to it's 2 weeks, I haven't heard from them. Should I send an email? Should I not send them an email? And you're getting all worked up about like, what's the proper timeline? Am I bugging them too much? Am I not bugging them enough? Do they think I don't care? Just ask.
And I would add to that, even you're going to ask about the timeline, you're going to ask, kind of about those details. But you could also even ask, if I don't hear from you by then, who should I follow up with? Is it okay if I follow up with you? Would you mind if I follow up with you? And that way, of course, you can always do it anyway, but it almost helps you the most because it makes you feel reassured that they said, yes, I can. I'll expect that she's going to follow up with me. So then when you do it, it makes sense for everyone.
Yeah, it shows you're reliable, that you do the things you say you're going to do. It shows that you're courteous and you're thinking of them and recognizing the fact that they're a busy person and that unless they're HR, this is not their only job. So I think that is actually a really great way of signaling a lot of different virtues that you might have.
Yeah. Any last interview words of wisdom that you wanted to give before we wrap up?
Yes, I want to give my number one piece of advice for interviewing, which I call the pause. You do not need to immediately answer a question, especially if it's one that kind of comes out of left field. There is nothing wrong with taking a moment or two to think about it. And what I suggest doing, and practice doing this ahead of time, because the first time you do it, it might feel kind of awkward. But when they ask you a question and you're kind of like smacked across the face, I suggest saying, "That's a really interesting question," or "That's a really good question." And then again, with that kind of showing compassion to the other person, say, "Would you mind if I took a second to like kind of formalize my thoughts on that?" And no one is going to say, "No, you have to answer now." And the only job where that would seem really bad is if you wanted to be like the spokesperson for a company. Like you need to be, if you're going to be in front of the press and they're going to put microphones in your mouth, you have to be able to answer immediately. But for every other job, you can take a second to think. Don't make it too long, but take a second to think, kind of like put in a mental bullet point of like one or two things that I want to say as a response. And then after you've had that second, then you come back to him and you say, "Thank you for giving me that moment. Here's what I've been thinking about." And the pause will feel much longer to you than it feels to them.
Yeah, I actually have two other strategies that go along with that I think are helpful for people. So one is just to take a sip of water, like maybe even say, "Oh, excuse me, I just need a sip of water." And that gives you a second without even having to ask. And the other one that I really love, which is especially helpful for people who might get anxious even with the pause, because you might not be able to think about the question anymore. You might be thinking about them watching you, which I know would be true for me.
Yeah.
So instead of that, you could actually say, "Oh my gosh, that's such an interesting question. Would you mind giving me an example of what you were thinking of?" And I've actually used this myself. And the person who was interviewing me gave the example, and it was perfect because it gave me time to process and time to think about what I wanted to say, and then also showed me exactly what she was hoping for in the answer. So I think people might not realize that they can ask for an example, or they might feel like that's weird, but like that's definitely something that you can do too.
Yeah, or even just ask for a little bit more explanation about what the question really is. Because sometimes they word a question and it makes sense in their minds, but it doesn't make sense to you. So going back to them, but like, "That's a really interesting question. When you said blank, did you mean this? Or could you tell me a little bit more about what you meant when you specifically said whatever thing?" And
Yes,
then
those
they can
clarifying.
explain it. Yeah,
Yeah.
clarifying questions are perfectly fine. It also shows them that you are listening, that you are thinking, and that's a really good thing. And in terms of things being conversations, as a journalist, as a person who is out there with a camera in people's faces, interviewing them, I was always trying to remember that I needed to be listening when you begin asking them questions. Listen to their answer and ask follow-up questions based on their answer. Don't go immediately into your head and think of what your next question is. It has to be a conversation. You have to be aware of what message they're giving you. Look for some of those body signal messages. And again, if you are autistic and that's something that you struggle with, see what you can do to practice on that ahead of time so that you feel a little bit more comfortable. Practice first interviewing with people who you know, who you care about, who have been around you for a long time. Then maybe ask them if there's someone else that they know and trust who you could interview with, who's like, a second degree connection. You don't know them, but somebody you know knows them. So like give yourself baby steps to building a little bit more confidence in talking to someone else, and practice that back and forth improv. You say something, I respond to what you say, and then I, go back and forth and make it two-way and not just me telling you things and then that stops, and then you tell me things and that stops.
Yeah, which is sometimes really hard to do for people, like you said, especially if you're neurodivergent, not even just autistics, but sometimes even ADHDers. Like your mind is going so fast that now all of a sudden you're on to the next thing and you forgot what they were even saying. So I like your suggestions about practicing because just like anything else, it's a skill that you can improve on. And I think the benefit of being able to make the conversation really conversational is huge because it puts you more at ease. It puts them more at ease. They start thinking they like you. They're having this conversation. It's so enjoyable. You know, the interviewer usually is not going to enjoy interviewing either. On the other side of this, none of us are enjoying it. So let's make it more human so that we can have a better time.
Yeah. And I'll tell you the truth. I'm a nerd. I actually enjoyed going for interviews. I get pumped up, but I was also a journalist and my job was to interview people. So when that's your job, or maybe if you're a person with a lot of theater improv background, you really like it, but that's not the majority of people. They're looking for a coworker who they're going to talk to, who they're going to interact with, who they're going to trust, who they're going to maybe disagree with and have to overcome that. And they want you to be that right person that they want to have on their team and be their collaborator.
Exactly. So, Sara, where can people find you, follow you, connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm quite active on LinkedIn. Just my name, Sara, with no H, because then I'd be Sarah or Sarah Huff. Since I'm neither of those, it's Sara, Sara, and then Kobilka, Kob as in boy, Ilka. I also have my website, renwomanconsulting.com. You can sign up for my free newsletter for career coaching, which is Take It With You. I'm a little bit on hiatus of publishing that, but I will certainly be putting out a post that's all about today's interview, and I'll be adding more things there. And there's a whole history of things that I've already written about in there. And then I'm also building a community for Renaissance people. So you can listen to my podcast, Connecting the Dots with the Renaissance People, to hear more from other interesting Renaissance people. And if you sign up, you can do that on my renwomanconsulting.com website for the newsletters that I send out for that community. You can learn about the podcast. You can learn about other things. I have a new service that I am doing, which is called Find Your Golden Thread. And that service is a 1-hour meeting with me where we help craft the story, the general story behind who you are in the past, present, and where you want to go in the future, and connect all of these disparate things that you've done with a single unified story that you can then use for your LinkedIn profile. You can use it when somebody invites you as a speaker and you have to give a bio or whatever it might be that you're doing. Just having that unified story, or the next time that you get interviewed and you get asked that question, so tell me about yourself, you will have already put some thoughtful time into what is a story that I have woven together that I can tell that pulls together who I am and what I'm all about.
Excellent. Well, we will have all of those links in the show notes for anyone looking for those. So thank you again for being here, Sara. It was so great to have you back.
It was wonderful. I can't wait to join again another time, Melissa. Thank you.
If you love this podcast, be sure to hit subscribe, leave me a review, and share it with a friend so we can help more high-performing misfits find work they love. See you next time.